Hello, and welcome to the Healed with Alyssa podcast. I am so excited for you guys to learn more information from me. This podcast is going to be all about helping heal your child and your family naturally without drugs or surgery. So let's get into it. Hi, and welcome to today's episode of Healed with Alyssa. Today, I wanted to talk about antibiotics and gut health and how antibiotics can affect the gut. So I'll start with a little story that happened this past week with my toddler who's 3 years old. So he got a cut at school and it was pretty deep. He had a laceration and he needed to get 8 stitches. Now, because he cut himself on a dirty surface, the surgeon, we went to a plastic surgeon, the surgeon wanted to put him on antibiotics, which is a common thing that, doctors do if there's a wound that has a potential risk of infection, a dirty surface that he cut it on. Also, I don't know if you ever had a toddler who needed to get stitches, but it is not the cleanest procedure. He was all over the place. He was, thrashing, moving his head. So yeah, it's a high risk of an infection and the doctor wants to cover themselves. But me, as a holistic nurse practitioner who has been working on their child's gut health for the last 3 years, my son had a lot of gut issues as a baby. He has never had antibiotics in his life. So I was not starting now with prophylactic antibiotics based off of his, in his wound. So what I did was I did my muscle testing with his wound, and I tested to see if there was any type of bacteria in there and how strong the bacteria was. And then I found a herbal tincture that I could use in place of antibiotics. So if we go back to our ancestors, they didn't use antibiotics as much as we use today. That's why there is so much antibiotic resistance and people just having to go through so many antibiotics because they are being so overused. It's like crazy. We're not addressing the root cause of what's going on in the body. So I put him on his herbal tinctures and, he's taking his regular supplements to help support his immune system, help support his mitochondria, because mitochondria is really important when you're trying to heal. And I also have been putting silver gel. So like colloidal silver, they have like wound gel, and that's what I've been putting topically on his wound. And it is healing amazing. I'm actually cannot even believe it, how amazing it's healing. And he never got antibiotics. So let's talk about what antibiotics do, because people think that antibiotics is just like, oh, it's no big deal. It's not going to bother anything. So when you take antibiotics, it is going to clear everything out. Right? So we have good bacteria and we have bad bacteria. And the good bacteria is good, right? It helps our immune system. It helps with digestion. So we do not want to clear out all the bacteria in our gut. In our gut, on our skin has certain bacteria that protects us from, more harmful bacterias. Also, when we take antibiotics, we are much higher risk for yeast issues. So it's why a lot of people who get take antibiotics, sometimes they get yeast infections after. That is common because it's clearing out all good bacteria, and good bacteria is important for keeping yeast in a balance. So I was not going to let my child take these antibiotics. And for most people, it would be like, oh, it's just amoxicillin. Like, it's benign. It's no big deal. But we have struggled, right, with bloating and gas and vomiting and colic. And I wasn't going to do it. So So yeah, when you take antibiotics, you're really wiping out all of the good flora in the body. So people, will take probiotics when they take antibiotic, which probiotics is good. I'm not going to say it's not good, but it's still important to just not altogether take them, right? So if a child has a constant urinary tract infection and their doctor only cure for that is taking antibiotic every few months, that is not addressing the root cause. So specific with urinary tract infections, I find a lot of toxins in the bladder, right? Because the whatever toxins are in the body are being filtered out through the kidneys and then excreted in the bladder through the bowels. So the bladder can get very irritated. So a common thing I find in the bladder is pesticides, right? If you're eating a ton of grains, you find pesticides. Also, I find radioactive elements like radiation in the bladder. I find mold to be affecting the bladder. So rarely do I find bacteria in the bladder, especially for someone who has chronic urinary tract infections. I find parasites in the bladder. So if you have if your diet is very high in sugar, then that can affect the bladder as well. So if you're constantly getting urinary tract infections or your child's constantly getting urinary tract infections, taking antibiotics is not addressing the root cause, right? That is just putting a band-aid on what is going on in the body. And even sometimes foods will aggravate the bladder, such as corn. Corn is a big trigger for bladder issues. Wheat is another big trigger for bladder issues as well, and dairy as well. So those are certain things that you can do to help if you are struggling with urinary tract infections. If your child is constantly getting ear infections, that is another common thing. And just taking antibiotics is not going to treat the root cause. So, what we recommend is going to the chiropractor on a regular basis is a really important way to keep the ear canals flowing in a proper manner, getting any drainage out if there is any drainage issues. So for kids specifically, their ear canals are very straight, right? Adults are more on a slant, and that is why kids are more prone to ear infections. And then, if they're laying down a lot, they're drinking milk laying down, can aggravate it as well. So if your child's always getting ear infections, another thing to look at is removing dairy. So dairy can be really, really an issue for people with ear infections. So doing chiropractic on a regular basis is really great for people who are getting ear infections all the time. Cutting out on dairy and sugar, processed foods is another really great tool to help with someone who's getting chronic ear infections. And the answer is not just getting ear tubes, right? That's not the answer. That we need to address the underlying causes of inflammation in the body, right? Because that is a sign of inflammation. So, and I see kids that they take amoxicillin and then the amoxicillin doesn't work, then they have to take a stronger antibiotic. So it just goes on and on and on. And these kids' guts are being destroyed from all of these antibiotics. And just taking a probiotic on top of that is not necessarily the answer for that. I also generally I like to recommend putting herbal tinctures in the ears. So para 3 is a great herbal tincture that helps if my son has ear pain and I put those in his ears, the drops, the ear pain completely goes away. Right. And then some people will say, well, my child's always getting pneumonia. So there is a root cause. Like, what is affecting the lungs for them to be in such a state of what is going on with the lungs for them to be in such a vulnerable state, right? So there's a toxin affecting the lungs. So sometimes it's mold, sometimes it's parasites, sometimes heavy metals, Sometimes maybe they were breathing in pesticides that they sprayed on the neighbor's lawn. So it really has a lot to do with the toxic load on the body, which is causing these increased risks of bacteria. So bacteria is there because there's a toxin present. So finding out what toxin it is and getting it out of the body so that the body can heal itself. Because the body is designed to heal itself. It doesn't want to, the body isn't meant to take antibiotics, right? Our ancestors, hundreds of years ago, they were not taking antibiotics for every little thing. When I was working at the hospital as a nurse, the antibiotic resistance was insane, right? These people were getting the strongest antibiotics and then they were starting to develop resistance to that. Why is that? Because we are using way too much antibiotics. And also going back to the probiotic talk, a really great way to get probiotics is through food, right? So eating like sauerkraut, kimchi, things like that is a really good way to get natural probiotics instead of just taking a supplement for it. So that is just some little tips I have about antibiotics. If your child is struggling with getting chronic ear infections or always sick, always needing antibiotics, then I would recommend addressing the root cause. So we help kids and adults to improve their health naturally. So I will put the link to schedule an appointment in the show notes if you are interested in making an appointment with me. Also, I appreciate you for listening to this episode. If this episode resonated with you, I would greatly appreciate it if you could leave a review and maybe share with someone that you think could use the information, or maybe their child is struggling with chronic ear infections or always having to take antibiotics. So that is all for today, and I thank you so much for being here, and I will see you on the next episode. If this podcast episode resonated with you, please share it with another mother or another family who's going through similar issues. And if you could please leave us a review and a rating, it would mean the world to me. Thank you so much for listening, and I will see you on the next episode.